Hi, I'm Danny, and I'm going to talk about building infrastructure for mobile teams. I also don't have speaker notes, so memory test. I work at CircleCI, where I build and maintain tools for mobile developers, and I also work on our OS X CI platform. I'm one of the maintainers of CocoaPods, which is a dependency manager for iOS and Mac developers, used in like over 2 million applications now, which is pretty amazing, I think. And I'm one of the maintainers of Fastlane, which is build and release automation software for iOS and Android people. And before I worked at Circle, I was an iOS developer for about 8 years. And my favorite build of Xcode, Xcode 3.2.1, with the best Xcode icon that has ever existed, where I mostly worked as a consultant, going around a bunch of different teams and freelancing and doing all the things. And so let's talk about mobile development. How many of the people here are mobile developers? I assume all of you, because it's mobile optimized. Yeah. How many of you build tools for mobile developers? Whether that's just like random open source projects or like do that for your company or for other types of thing. OK. And how many of you enjoy working with the tools you have as mobile developers? OK. So if any of you have ever tried to like build an app on your phone, Apple made that a bit more easily recently. You sign into Xcode with your Apple ID. You let it fetch your development teams. And then you go through all your project targets and set the right development team. And then you build and run, and it kind of works. But what happens if you work on a team and you want to like install an app on your phone and own a bit more control of that? Well, it becomes this. Like, you do a bunch of stuff with apple.com, a lot of clicky UI, generating certificates, installing them into Xcode. Then you build and run, and you hope that everything works. Maybe it does. And then if you want to like test notifications, you do everything you did for the previous slide to get the app to run on your phone. But you also create all of these like tokens to use from your service. And then you spend like a really good day just being like, send test notification, and then nothing appears on your device. And you're just like, OK, did I mess up? Did the backend team mess up? Or like, did we use the wrong keys? Nobody ever knows. It's all a bit deep rabbit hole. And then like, if you want to release your app to the store, like step one is build an app. So you know that you're going to have a good day when you try and do this for the first time. And like, honestly, after going to like release your first app for the store, you're probably a little bit like this. Just sad, crying, like, why? Why did I do this to myself? But what we want to be is like this. Like, we want to be really happy. We want to enjoy what we do, despite the fact that computers don't work. And so what are some like common problems people run into on mobile teams? Like code signing, obviously, because it's sadness. And then like when you do that, you have the really long review times in the App Store where you maybe are allowed in to the secret wall garden. But then you're sometimes not because the person woke up on the wrong side of the bed that day. And then like when you release software, like users decide when they update their app because like automatic updates don't always work. Oh, they're never fast enough. Or maybe they just don't connect to Wi-Fi. And then like testing in CI is a pain. Deploying is a pain because you build everything in Xcode, and then you go and sign everything, and then you release it, then you have to add all the metadata. And then like when your app's in production, is it working? Like, is the fact that you have no feedback coming back the fact you have no users? Or is the app just crashing on launch? Or is it all fine? So let's talk about code signing. Story time. So code signing is like what you do to your finished application to like allow it to run on a device or in the App Store or whatever. And in many teams for a long time, it was always seemed to be the case that like one person had the deployment credentials. Like one person on the team had all the certificates. So like the end of every day, like one person would go away, take the master branch, spend the last half of their day creating a build for QA, sending it to the QA team, waiting to see what they said the next day. And then like when you decided you actually wanted to release to the store or to beta users, this same person, because they have the one magical blessed machine, would go and like produce an app that would go and like do the laborious thing of clicking through iTunes Connect. As you can tell, I've been this person too many times. And then you would ship the app to the store, and everything would be fine. Until you got told 10 minutes later that it was all broken. But like that's a different problem for later. But like there's a good solution for managing that now. Fastlane has a tool called Match, which lets you bundle up all of your certificates and share them amongst the team using an encrypted Git repo. I think it's encrypted. I don't remember. And like, there's also a bunch of documentation on how to use that, which gets rid of the problem of how do we deploy the app? This person is sick. Or how do we deploy the app? This person left 3 months ago, which is pretty nice. But I'm going to talk more about distribution because that's a problem that is really annoying for a lot of people. So how many people have released an app in the last like year? Basically everyone. Good. This is good. Or it's sadness. Depends on your setup. So in a traditional like mobile app release process, it was kind of what I described with code signing, where one person would have like all of these things, and like this person would go and take your app and do the deploying and do all of the like laborious work of doing with that. But like the entire mobile process back when I started doing iOS development, when the iOS SDK came out, well, iPhone iOS SDK, was like you'd receive the spec from whoever you were working with, you would go and build it, and then you'd send it to QA, and then you'd come back and it'd be broken. And it was all just like this. It was all just very waterfall and very sadness. But like it worked, right? You would get a working product to the end of it. It might take you 6 months to a year, but you would have something. And then people came along and they touted Agile. This is this really cool new way of working, don't you know? This new fresh-faced developer would come in saying. And they'd be like, so now what we do is we decide what we're going to do for the next 2 weeks. And then we go and do all of that. And then we send it to QA. And then nothing else. So like it was a bit faster than like what you did with the old approach, but like it still was pretty slow, still was pretty laborious, and a lot of the time you would spend more time in like 6-hour planning meetings than you would like actually doing what you needed to be doing with your day. And like, yeah, at the end of like every week, someone would go and deploy the app to QA. But like, does that sound familiar to anyone? Like, yeah, I see a lot of forlorn faces. So what about continuous delivery, you hear the people say? Continuous delivery in the traditional sense of like every commit you push gets deployed doesn't really work in a mobile app. Because you have like the big like up to 2-week release window, which is down to like a few days usually now, but still it's nowhere near continuous. But we can actually get pretty close when you look at what the actual tenets of continuous delivery are. Because it's about getting value to your users more consistently. And so what a lot of people do is they start doing release trains where, as Sam talked about earlier today, you say we ship every sort of X period, you get your features in or you don't, and they make the next release train. So what sort of are release trains? Like they're regular cycles when you will ship your app to whatever environment. like hopefully production, because it's nice to get bug fixes in your users' hands. Like for this, you kind of need to use feature flags. And so like when you're working on a feature with like few other people on your team, you can sort of flag and then enable like separate parts as you release. And like one of the advantages of this is you build trust within the company. So a lot of the times when I was working in mobile development, the like customer or the like product team or whatever would basically just assume that developers want to do like the least possible, because we're just like, no, like this is so much work to do in one go, like it's going to be so broken. And they don't understand that if you ship the smaller features first, and then you can build on top of them and build on top of them and make everything better. When you start getting a regular release cadence and they start to see that working and things making it out more often, they start to trust in you to deliver. It also builds trust with customers, because if a customer files a bug ticket and they know you release regularly, they know that like, and you say like the fix is coming soon or it's going to be in the next release, they know when that's going to be. And they're not going to have to wait a long time for that. And it makes shipping software less scary. Because if you do it a lot, A, you get more practice, and B, you end up automating it. Because who wants to, like, every other Friday spend their entire afternoon releasing the app? They don't. They want to spend, like, maybe a few days setting up something to automate this, and then they want to just run that. But if you do this, please maintain a changelog. I don't want to know that like you ship me software every 2 weeks to like keep me up to date with your whatever ad platform, whatever, or your like random bug fixes or more like A/B tests. So for automating your train, like choo-choo, Fastlane is pretty good for this. It has a few tools. So it has Snapshot, which will go and automatically take all of your localized screenshots, because that takes a really long time. Like, especially if your app has like 30 localizations or whatever, and you have like 5 screenshots and 2 different device sizes that you take screenshots for. There goes a week. Like, who has time for this? And then Gym, which will handle building your app, and then Pilot to distribute that to TestFlight or to the App Store. And then you can also start running all of this on CI. So you can push to like a release branch or like tag a build on master, and then like have CI go and take all of the screenshots, do all of the things, have it like show you a preview, and then just sort of like manually approve that you want to release like all of this stuff. And that can save teams a lot of time and also make all of this a lot more reliable. Sadly can't automate the anxiety caused by bumping the major version number, which this is the German word for. Thanks to Jan Learnhardt, who gave a talk at JSConf in Berlin a couple of years ago, I think, where this was referenced, which was about the same time as I started learning German, so I was very excited, because this is me every time I ship a CocoaPods release. Like, did I break anything? Do I need to bump the version number? Please no. But you can get a lot closer. So depending on what you want your version numbers to mean, you can either manually update that before you push to a release branch, or do it based on your tag. Or if you ship all of the time, then I guess you can just use like the commit shop, but that doesn't really mean anything to your users. Like, hi, I'm using version 9E4F. What? But version numbers don't mean anything to a lot of people anyway. There are a lot of marketing, seemingly, these days. But like when you've shipped your software with your magical new release process, how do you actually go about sort of like knowing that it works in production? So is the next slide what I think it is? Yes. I remember working on an app a few years ago where we shipped the first version of this app. It did a major like marketing release. Like it was advertised on the side of like buses in the city where this app was localized for. Also, seeing an app you wrote on the side of a bus is kind of weird. Like you don't really associate buses with like with like computers. It's like seeing a photo of a phone is kind of weird. But like, so we did this big marketing launch. All of these buses were going out, and like, we had no idea if the app was working. Like, we had no crash logging. We had no, like, we had some analytics, so we knew it was being installed. But the analytics library had broken, so we didn't actually get any of the usage events being sent because there was some bug somewhere. I think it was a threading bug in the way it was trying to send data. It was very sad. And we weren't getting any support tickets. And then at like 12 o'clock, like we got a couple of emails with like some crashing bugs. Turns out it crashed on an entire category of device. But like we didn't know this, and we were left in the blind, and it was terrifying. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Just like the sinking dread of not knowing. Yeah. So like no bug reports means you have no bugs, right? Or it means you have no users. But like inferring state from the absence of data is not something you want to make a habit of doing. And so like it's really important to at least have like some basic crash reporting, which I think most people have these days, in the form of like Crashlytics or Hockey App or Bugsnag or like all of these things that are all based on this one open source library called PL Crash Reporter. So you can also like use this to send like crash reports to your own service if you want to. It's also kind of useful to have performance monitoring in your app or some kind of like usage data. So if you have any hot paths in your app that are likely to cause problems for people, it can be useful to sort of trace that somehow, which can be super useful for figuring out what's going on in production. But in a lot of mobile apps, this isn't particularly necessary as long as you have crash reporting. But like, it's important to note that performance tracking is not your analytics. Like, analytics shouldn't be used to be debugging like production, but I've definitely seen cases where like the way you figure out what someone was doing leading up to a crash is you go into like Crashlytics or Hockey App and you get the envoy you were setting with their analytics ID, and then you go into like Mixpanel, paste in their tracking ID, and then you see all the events that were going on, and then try and reproduce it. But that's not ideal. And you can also do a bunch of stuff, like if you have an API, by tracking some events that go through there. So like if you send the app version in your headers, and like also related to the like performance monitoring, track errors when you're passing like critical responses. It can be a really good way to know if like someone's just released a backend update that has broken everything, or if like there's a bug in the app, you'll see it pretty quickly. But when you do this, like how do you manage old releases now you're releasing so often? Like it's important to sort of like potentially have a mechanism to force updates for older releases, either by telling the API to like stop returning responses if your app version is older than X, or if it's one of certain things. Okay. And then set a policy for how long an old version should be supported for. Because otherwise, like you have this thing of like, we have all these people using this version, but it's broken, and we don't want to keep supporting it because we have to do all this work in the API, or similar. And a good way to manage things like this is by using what's called an API gateway, which is a service that takes API calls from your app, and then it goes and makes any API calls it needs to like populate your application. Which means you can have an API that's actually designed for your app without having to go and make a ton of API calls to like fill a screen of data. it's also because like API versioning isn't always enough. Like, because for true API versioning to actually work, you would need to bump the version of your API every time you changed any like style of data you're putting through it. Like, because theoretically, adding a field could be a breaking change in some clients. It shouldn't be, but it could. Or maybe now it starts returning nil instead of an empty string, and then your null handling dies somewhere deep in your Swift JSON parsing library. It also makes it easier to maintain compatibility with older app versions by taking those changes and fixing them after you get the data back from other services. And it allows you to easily release new features with no risk of breaking older users. And you can transform responses based on the app version. And it also makes it easier to forcibly shut down older app versions. But like, this is all a lot of work that doesn't maybe seem like it fits in a mobile team. Or maybe it does. So what is the job of a mobile team? Is it building features for your customers? Is it fixing and avoiding more bugs? Is it understanding your users' needs? Or is it becoming expert users of iTunes Connect? So in my mind, the main goal of a mobile team is to deliver value to the people that use your software and to the business. So who has time for dealing with all of the other like monitoring and deployment setup and like dealing with all of that? Well, like in most teams, nobody has time for that. Like whoever has more cycles in their like sprints or in their week. But it turns out that like backend people have something that they call like DevOps or like build and infrastructure engineers. But like, what is DevOps apart from just being a buzzword that people like to throw around on the internet? In my mind, it's like people who are developers, but their main job is not building features or like fixing bugs. It's enabling the team to do that and to like take the team's value and ship that to users. But like, why is that important? Well, like a lot of this stuff is a very different skill set to the one of actually building an application. Like in building an app, you have to care so deeply about like animation and UI and like performance and reliability and stability. But you like, it's not fundamental to your job to understand the infrastructure that goes around getting that to people, at least inside bigger teams. And inside smaller teams, there's a lot of solutions that you can use that have already been built that you don't need to build yourself. So, to recap, we went over some approaches to some common mobile problems. We acknowledge that you don't need to hack solutions to these together. Like, there are solutions you can use, or you can build your own. But it's useful to understand that, like, outsourcing these problems is fine. Like, this is why tools like Hockey App exist, why things like Fastlane exist, that give you the power to do things that you want to do, while also making it really easy to get started. And so, like, bye-bye the hacky bash scripts of the past. Because while everything can be reduced to a bash script, please don't. And that's me. Any questions?
Okay. Thanks for the great talk. Well, the question is, can you share the time that you spent from going from like the bash scripts or whatever raw design of your tools you had to the modern release trains approach? So is it like a month or half a year? How did you convince the business that you need to convert the process to build the trust you were talking about? And that's it. Thanks.
So that is a question that definitely depends on the organization you're working in. I've definitely worked in places that it has taken like 6 months to get them to try it. Because they always like a lot of definitely like sort of older organizations or people that come from game development backgrounds specifically is where I've had the most problem. Where they're used to putting in all of the work up front and don't understand that software evolves over time. They want to go and build the entire specification and ship that to customers. And you have to start being able to show people that like you can get a lot of that value without necessarily going to the full extent. And that can be difficult. It usually takes more than one person. Like it takes someone in the product organization usually being willing to give it a shot with like their team. Because product organizations usually have a lot more control than engineering does about how these things work. And like it sort of takes that and then starting to show the business that actually you can execute like this. But there is some risk that people are not going to be happy with you while you do that. I've definitely had some not fun conversations while trying to port people over to like better practices. So yeah, there's no silver bullet. Anybody else?
I would like to hear your opinion about the threshold to move uploading your application to App Store from manual to automated. So for example, if I make it 2 times a month, does it make sense to implement all this automation because I spend, for example, like 1 hour in a month to do it? Does it make sense to invest time to automate this process? And what is the factor from your perspective to start automating this?
So
what is the criteria? How often should I do it to start to automate it?
So my thing with this is I start out by automating the things that annoy me when I'm doing it, because that's usually very little work to automate to get a lot of value to me. And then I start looking at what will happen when I leave. Partially because I was a contractor for so long, like I want to know that when I go, you're in the best possible place to do this. Or like if I'm on holiday or if I'm sick and you need to get a release out. And so it kind of depends. If it's an hour a month, then it's probably a pretty simple process with like not much in the way of localization or like your app's not changing much. You don't need to go and retake all of the screenshots. And therefore it might not necessarily be worthwhile for you. For me, I usually start automating things if they take me like more than like, no, like if I do something more than like 3 times a week, no. Yeah, if I do something more than 3 times a week, I definitely automate it. If I do something more than twice a month, then I probably automate it. And then further than that, I don't do it often enough to know that automation actually will work. Yeah, it depends on what you're trying to get out of it.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. Maybe it's a little off topic, but from the contributor perspective, how did it change to contributing to Fastlane since acquisition by Google?
So because I partially contribute for work, the main change for me was having to go through deal with the CLA because I had to go through legal. But for the most part, it hasn't really changed. I don't really have a huge amount of time to contribute much to source. I usually help out more with review and with helping with random Ruby or Xcode questions right now. Yeah, fastlane hasn't changed so much. At least from my perspective. Does that answer your question? Cool. Anyone else? Cool.